thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, and I understand that you all have had a great two-day conference.
Yes.
And let me tell you what I like most about you being here. It means that you care about the future of this country. That's why you have developed. You know, there are two things that I don't do well with. It's not jackets. It's podiums and teleprompters. That ain't exactly my style. I feel like if I'm behind this podium, I have something between you and me. And there isn't going to be anything between us as I talk about what it is that we need to do to take back our country. Let's go all the way back for a moment, very briefly, to the founding fathers. They got it right. They got it right. They said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all, don't turn me down, don't turn me down. I know when they start turning it down because I project. Founding fathers said, that's what I'm talking about. See, that's what I'm a trained professional, man. They want it to be smooth and pristine. I'm not into smooth and pristine when I'm talking about this country. The founding fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator.
That's right.
With certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You are involved with this great organization because the pursuit of happiness is under attack. I am running for President of the United States of America because the pursuit of happiness is under attack. I describe it as it's under attack by the Asians. A-T-I-O-N-S. Last time I used that opening, somebody thought I said something else. A-T-I-O-N-S, the Asians. Too much legislation. Obamacare. Too much regulation. The EPA. And too much taxation. The whole tax code is a mess. It's under attack. And as a result of this gradual onslaught against what the founders intended, this nation is headed in the wrong direction. We have become a nation of crises. We have a moral crisis. There are those that want to ignore that the founders were godly men and women. They want to take God out of our culture. They challenge everything, including a religious symbol at ground zero.
Right.
Anything to try and take our spirituality, whatever your religious preference. It's not about any one particular religious preference. It's about the ability and the right. The First Amendment says that government cannot impose religion on us. It does not say we cannot express our religion in public places.
Right.
It doesn't say that. Now, as believers, many of us throughout history have sort of pushed back. But we got to do more than just push back, folks. We have an economic crisis. We have an energy crisis. We have an entitlement spending crisis, just to name a few. We have an immigration crisis. And we have a foggy foreign policy crisis. And the biggest one we have is a deficiency of leadership crisis. Now, I could go through every one of those crises and tell you what I would do about it, but you don't want to be here all night. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. Because the approach that I use in order to solve problems is the same, regardless of which crisis we're dealing with. It's the same approach that I have used in business for over 40 years to fix stuff, to lead stuff, to turn around stuff, and to save stuff. It's called having some real world experience. Yeah. That's what I bring to the party. Let's talk about the economic crisis, since that's one of the biggest ones that's on our minds every day. And you know the thing that motivates me to never allow that one to get lost in the rhetoric of those 15 million people that can't find a job. Exactly. The reason they can't find a job is real simple. Our economic growth is dependent upon the economic engine called the business sector. If you do not put fuel in the engine, it's not going to grow. If you continue to put stuff in the caboose, you load down the economy and it does not grow. It is no wonder that the most recent GDP growth rate was a measly 1.3%. And they had to revise the first quarter growth rate down to 0.4%. We have the ability to grow at 5, 6, or 7%. The only reason we're not growing is because this administration has put nothing in the engine called the business sector. That's why we're not growing. And then the president of this administration had the audacity to say, well, they didn't spend enough on that $1 trillion that they spent for stimulus. It didn't work. What part of it didn't work don't they understand? It didn't work. So they want to spend more. That's not common sense. Here's what the Cain economic vision would look like. Phase 1 and phase 2. See, it's so bad, folks. It's not a silver bullet that's going to fix everything. First phase, I would ask the United States Congress. I do have to work with them. I recognize that. You can't ignore the United States Congress. The first phase was to ask Congress to send me legislation that we would pass in the first 90 days that would first lower the top corporate and personal tax rates to a maximum of 25%, both personal and corporate. Secondly, suspend taxes on foreign repatriated profits. We have nearly $3 trillion offshore. And the reason that that money doesn't come back home is real simple. Companies are avoiding double taxation. I know. I served on the board of directors of several major corporations for the last 20 years. I know what we talk about in the boardroom. Lately, we haven't been talking about growth. We've been talking about how do we survive and how do we get around paying double taxation. Thirdly, take the capital gains tax rate to zero. Now the liberals, they will be the first to say, well, you can't do that. Well, we're going to have to compromise. This economy doesn't need a compromise. It needs an injection that's going to help it grow. Some things you don't compromise on. Compromise isn't the end all. And then the most important part of phase 1, make them permanent. Make them permanent. Uncertainty is killing this country. It's killing this economy. Businesses don't plan for a couple of months at a time. They plan for years at a time. That's phase 1. And I'm going to be insistent upon the United States Congress passing that legislation for me to sign within the first 90 days. Now, the skeptics, they are quick to say, well, you can't do that. What do you mean you can't do that? Well, you don't know how Washington works. Yes, I do. It doesn't. Why do I want to learn how it does not work? That doesn't make any sense. Former Senator Eric Dirksen popularized the statement, when they feel the heat, they will see the light. Now here's how this is going to work. I'm going to be president. Ask Congress to send me that legislation without a lot of bells and whistles, without earmarks, and then I'm going to explain it to the American people. It's going to be short enough that everybody can understand it, and if you understand it, you're going to be the heat to put on Congress in order to get them to pass it. You be the heat. That's why your organization and all of the other organizations are so important. We must mobilize the people to be the heat on Congress to get what the people want and not what the politicians want. Y'all gonna be the heat. All I can do is tee it up, make sure you understand it, because one of my guiding principles is, if people understand it, they will support it and demand it. And that's how we're gonna get that first phase passed for this economic vision. Phase 2. You know, I believe that doing those things is going to open up a lot of economic growth. And that might get us to maybe 4 or 5 percentage points. But we need more than that. Because you see, China is growing at 10% per year compounded, even though it's on a much smaller base. And we are growing at this measly 1.3, 0.4%. It's already been estimated that if we don't start growing faster, they're going to catch us in 5 years. And that doesn't need to happen. So here's phase 2 of this economic booster plan. Totally replace the tax code with the fair tax. Totally replace it. Earlier today I was at another event, and Hugh Hewitt was the, he's from Denver, I think. Hugh Hewitt was the moderator. And so someone asked the question about the fair tax. And so Hugh Hewitt was the first one to say, well, Herman, Mr. Cain, I guess since I'm running for president, he calls me Mr. Cain. He said, Mr. Cain, you know, I hate the fair tax. I said, I know that, Hugh. I love the fair tax, and you're simply misinformed. If you understand the fair tax, and that's the operative word, if you understand the fair tax, there is nothing to hate. The people who hate the fair tax and the people who are against changing the current system, they want to maintain the status quo, so the politicians keep telling you how much you pay in taxes. When you go to the fair tax, you decide what you pay in taxes based upon consumption, not based upon income. Now, the reason that I'm going to wait until the second 2 years of my term to basically try to get that passed is because we've got to educate the public. People need to be informed, because there are more lies about what the fair tax does and does not do than there are truths out there. Amen. And remember, if the people understand it, they will support it and they will demand it. This is how we get this economy going. And whether we're talking about the economy, whether we're talking about immigration, entitlement spending, my approach to problem solving is exactly the same. Make sure you're working on the right problem. If the economy is not growing, you're not working on the right problem. This economy is not growing. So they must be working on the wrong problem. Spending is not, they need to work on spending, but we cannot spend our way to prosperity. Secondly, surround yourself with good people. This is what I've done in every business venture I've had, whether it was the Pillsbury Company as an executive, whether it was Burger King Corporation as an executive, whether it was when I was president and CEO of Godfather's Pizza, president and CEO of the National Restaurant Association. The same approach works. Ask anybody that succeeded at anything. You got to make sure you're working on the right problem. You surround yourself with good people that will help you put together the right common sense plans in order to execute. And that's all that represents relative to that economic vision. It didn't take me a bunch of slides. and 2 days to explain that. And you get it. Get it. Let's talk a little bit about another one of these crises. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of these are interrelated. Energy. I think you all know we have an energy crisis. I believe that we have, I not only believe, I know, based upon some reports, that we have all of the energy resources we need in order to become energy independent. I am already working on an energy independence strategy for the United States of America. Instead of going to Brazil and telling Brazil we are going to be their best customer for their oil with our money, let me tell you what the Cain doctrine is. We're going to be our own best customer for oil, all of it. Our own best customer. Nuclear. Not leaving any of it out. We have the resources. We just haven't had the leadership and the common sense to do it. Now, the skeptics. Now, most of these skeptics are inside Washington, D.C. Every time I go to Washington, D.C., they try to tell me that this won't work. The skeptics are quick to point out, but how are you going to do all of that with the EPA in the way? Remember I said work on the right problem? I'm going to move them out of the way. Here's the approach of how we're going to do that. Now, I'm not going to walk in day one and say, okay, EPA, you're all fired. That's not how you do that.
Why not?
Day two, you say you're all out of here. Y'all are cold-blooded. You know, ain't no prisoners. I have learned something about this thing. Y'all don't take any prisoners, and I love it. I bet you didn't turn their mic down, did you? You didn't mess with their mic when they were up here. I'm going to have what I call an EPA Regulatory Reduction Commission. And the people that are going to be appointed to that commission,
Me.
people like this lady, farmers, oil executives who have been abused by the EPA. They will decide how much EPA we need.
Oh my God.
I'm a president.
That's how you do that. You don't put a bunch of bureaucrats on a commission and say, figure out how to reduce the regulatory burden. We got to do the same thing for the Interior Department. We got to do the same thing for the Labor Department. For every department in Washington, D.C., education, every department will have a Regulatory Reduction Commission with citizens serving on it. Figure out how to go about this. And remember, when they start bringing me back recommendations and I go to Congress saying that I want to change these things that need congressional approval, y'all got to be my heat.
Oh, we'll be there.
Y'all got to be the heat.
We'll be there.
So that's what we do with energy. We've got the resources. Here's the other reason we must fix the energy issue. It's not only a matter of whether we're going to pay $4 a gallon for gas or not. It becomes a national security issue as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you want foreigners determining our national security fate if all hell breaks loose throughout the world? The answer is no. Absolutely not. And the good news is we have the resources, we have the technology, we have the expertise in order to do it. We simply need to remove a lot of these barriers that are in the way. So that's how we approach the energy crisis we face. The other big E is entitlement spending crisis. All you have to do is look at what has happened over the past couple of weeks on the debt ceiling crisis and realize that only a handful of people in Washington, D.C. are serious about getting our hands around this spending crisis. And it is a crisis, folks. And the way I propose that we go about this, first of all, relative to the debt ceiling crisis, this crisis didn't need to happen. A leader would have put together a plan a year ago
That's right.
to prevent the crisis.
Right.
A year ago, we knew this was going to happen. We knew this, but you didn't hear it in a speech. A year ago, here's what I would have done. Number one, make sure we are able to pay the interest on the debt. Make sure we can pay our military and our military families. Make sure all the Social Security recipients get their payments. And make sure that people that are getting Medicare and Medicaid are also being paid. Those are what I call the necessities. Thank you very much. Those are what I call the absolute necessities. Then everything else is on the table. And you make the tough choices in terms of what you have to cut.
Right.
This is what they don't want to do, to make the serious cuts. And one of the reasons they avoid doing it is because when you look at Congress with 535 members, every one of them has some pet projects. And so as soon as somebody on the other side of the aisle or someone in the other house said, well, I don't know, we ought to cut this, we ought to reduce this, when then somebody raised their hand and said, well, you owe me a favor from 10 years ago, don't cut my pet program, so as a result, nothing gets cut. Well, let me tell you what happens when you send somebody to Washington, D.C. as president who has never held public office. I don't have any pet projects. I don't have any favors to pay back. And so we need to do an across-the-board cut, and then what I call a deep dive cut. That's what you do in business. That's what you do in business. You take every department or every agency, and you look at every program and figure out which ones need to be eliminated, which ones need to be cut. Maybe in some of the agencies we need to cut it 60%. Maybe in some other agencies we need to cut 80. Some agencies maybe we cut 20. You make common sense decisions about what ought to be cut in order to get our hands around it, not just let it continue to go up without somebody seriously challenging